In periods of distress or conflict, a powerful nation may look to its army and the weapons of war to bring about resolution or peace. However, the powerless and the marginalized must look to other sources for hope. It is not uncommon for those who feel disconnected and alienated from the surrounding world to imagine God and/or other heavenly beings intervening on their behalf in order to bring about vindication over all their enemies. Such hopes for divine intervention often may employ a rich variety of imagery and symbolism, representing the earthly and heavenly factors in eschatological conflict and triumph. The world and its agents in the conflict may be drawn into stark black and white to demarcate the dualistic divisions of good and evil. This alternative worldview finds its primary expressions in a genre of writing known as an apocalypse. Although the book of Revelation is the only full book example of this genre in the New Testament, portions of other books, such as Matthew 24 and 2 Thessalonians 2, are expressions of this literary form as well. Although traces of early apocalyptic thought may be found in such Old Testament writings as Ezekiel and Isaiah 24, the most important examples of Jewish apocalyptic motifs occur outside the Old Testament. In the late 3rd to early 2nd century BCE, while Israel was under Hellenistic domination, many apocalyptic writings emerged. Of the Old Testament writings, the book of Daniel, especially chapters 7 through 12, was written during this period, around 160 BCE, and contains profound examples of early Jewish apocalypses. In the apocalyptic visions of Daniel, the nations are depicted as mutated beasts, angels are portrayed as humans, and God is referred to as the Ancient of Days. Apocalypses were written as a Jewish expression of antagonism toward and resentment of foreign ruling powers and their misdeeds in the land of Israel. The author of Daniel describes his period of history as the end of days and expects God and heavenly agents to intervene and bring about Israel's triumph. The eschatological victory is envisioned to include the renewal of the temple, that is, Israel's restoration, as well as other events, such as the resurrection of the dead. Below the surface of such powerful imagery was a prevailing hope for a more just society in which the weak and persecuted find victory at the end of their suffering. In the final analysis, for the author of Daniel, the time of anguish will be severe, but it will not last forever, since your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Again, the book of Revelation is the only full book example of apocalyptic literature in the entire New Testament, and it comes closest to Daniel in its visions of heavenly mysteries now revealed. Along with other passages of apocalyptic language in the New Testament, Revelation shares a common theme that Christ's coming, called the parousia, will have ramifications for the end of the age. According to these texts, human history will reach a cataclysmic finality with the appearance of Christ. While the outcome looks bleak for many, it will also be the end of the lawless one, an agent of Satan, and finally the destruction of the chief antagonist, Satan, as well. Details vary in each of these selections as to how this will occur. Yet, despite the bizarre and mysterious images used throughout the passages, the vivid distinction between good and evil is fundamental for all of these early Christian expressions. In all Christian appropriations of this type of language also comes a deep-seated sense of hope. Words often difficult to pick out in the midst of descriptions of chaos. In Matthew chapter 24, the one who endures to the end will be saved, for the angels of the Son of Man will gather his elect from the four winds. For the Pauline author of 2 Thessalonians, those God has chosen will be gathered together to God after the parousia. In the final visions of John's revelation, even death itself will be destroyed, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. and people of every nation will reside forever in the New Jerusalem, for its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. These words of hope intermingle with the images of destruction, disaster, and loss as a forewarning to the people of God to stay on track and be encouraged. Today, these kinds of apocalyptic messages are either underappreciated or misinterpreted by many Christians because of contemporary distortions of this language. Attempts to impose a literal reading on these kinds of texts in an interpretive game to find specifically, for example, who the beast of Revelation might represent in contemporary society is a complete misunderstanding of the nature of apocalyptic literature. Yet we should also not forget that many communities throughout history who have favored such documents often found themselves with minimal resources except their imagination to confront oppressive ruling authorities. Such a creative exercise often includes visions of a new world order in which God, justice, and love reign supreme. However, it is not as if the creative idea of a new world order released followers of Jesus from their own responsibility. As Jesus himself said, "You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour." But in the end, for all of the attempts by apocalyptic writings to imagine a more just world, they confirm that God stands at the center. For the glory of God is the city's light, and its lamp is the Lamb. This word of hope to a discouraged people is the final word. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. It has become a dwelling place of demons, a haunt of every foul spirit, a haunt of every foul bird, a haunt of every foul and hateful beast. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxury. Wow. Living in the empire is not so fun for John.
I think John here is getting at the Greco-Roman War. We talk about the political reality of the days. Sharp contrast between the rich and the poor.
Yeah.
Those who are on top and those who are below. And the domination, greed, self-interest, that kind of evil going on. And you just can't miss Revelation 18. There about the merchant culture, for example. Selling of goods, but all for their own sake, and so blind to the needs of those who are in the lower level of the society.
Yeah. The consumeristic atmosphere of the Roman Empire is really put in the fore here.
Yeah.
You get this image of all the good things that are there to be enjoyed across the entire Mediterranean just being taken from the provinces by these merchants and their ships who are getting rich by it, and all flowing to the center where a few enjoy conspicuous consumption while others are struggling for subsistence.
So in certain sense, you can say that it's peace and security. That would define it. But in the hard reality of life, for many people then, it's about brutality, it's about violence, injustice. Therefore, what value of life is that?
If John were attempting to address Christians today, what would this message look like in context that you're familiar with?
Well, I think the modern culture is quite similar to this pre-modern society, where we can see the divisions between the rich and the poor, the dominations that goes on, happen also in countries like China, Malaysia, Singapore, that I know, corruption. It's not just under the table, it's so obvious.
Say more about your experience in China.
Yeah, it's very interesting because there are two groups of Christians in China, and they would read differently from the Revelation text. One group is the government monitor churches, the Three South churches, that would cooperate then with the government. They register with the government, so the government would know all the activities that they are doing. And this group would believe that by working with the government, even though they know that the government is an atheist government, is the best way, to work within that context. Therefore, to be the best witness in China. But then you have the second group, the underground churches, the house churches, sometimes we call them, because they don't register with the government, they go underground, and they would just love the revelation stuff. So in those cases, then we see the conflict between two types of Christianity in China. So what do you do?
In John's indictment of Rome, we've got language that takes us back to Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel. He's connecting with a whole very long tradition of God's witnesses speaking out against domination systems. Tyre, Nineveh, Babylon, even Jerusalem itself, now here in Rome. There's some constants here, right? Violence, using violence to make peace. Ideology, glorifying herself. How many cities glorified themselves, legitimated their rule by perpetuating myths about who they were and their role for the nations, silencing opposition. What is the significance of reading this as scripture here in America?
Yeah, this is, to hear KK talk about a different cultural setting is really helpful. Because I think in many ways, it forces us to look at ourselves a little more carefully. And when we think about, this word that John is putting forth is certainly a word for his own community, but it's a word for the Christian community. He's not writing to people outside of that context. And I think in the same way, he's writing for the Christian community today.
Right.
And so what should the Christian community hear out of this? What are the systems of domination that surround us? What are the ways that we attempt to secure peace? Are we violent? Do we have our own economic systems in place that benefit us? Are there certain ways that we treat others, both inside and outside of the country, that suggest perhaps untimely and unwise appropriations of our own goods and efforts?
Here's the thing, domination systems seem to exist to somehow create a safe, stable enjoyment of maximum good by just the people on the inside. And they'll do anything they can to preserve that status quo. That's the violence, the sucking of the provinces dry to bring luxury items to the center. Hearing you ask these questions, I am reminded of how my international students, again, have opened my eyes to ways in which America resembles Babylon to Christians living in other countries. And they have offered very timely words to me about not being so sure that when we read Revelation, we're not reading John's word to us in very real and pointed ways.
It's very interesting what you have just shared. I think it's precisely this point where the text of Revelation comes alive to us today. That its lesson is for them back then, but for us now, readers of the Bible, not to use the Bible to justify for the convenience of our existence, but rather to use the biblical text to read our culture, and especially the prophetic traditions that you talk about, the version use. Concern for the poor. How do we overcome a domination, for example, by this Lamb of God?
Yeah, if there's anything I think we want to try to take away from the book of Revelation, and I think this would be true about the rest of the New Testament as well, is an attempt to read the New Testament carefully enough that we can hear the critique against ourselves and not just use it to benefit ourselves. That seems to be central throughout.
That's a good point. Too often these texts have been used to put the onus on some other country, some other religious group. You're the ones that are failing. We don't use it for self-examination nearly enough.